The sound of the broom scraped the wet ground as the man, hunched over his own shadow, tried to clear away something the wind kept bringing back. The girl waited, her bare feet on the cold pavement, watching her father as one who guards the last image of a world about to disappear. Before we delve into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're tuning in from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The morning dawned slowly, shrouded in that opaque grey that was neither rain nor sun, but something between waiting and giving up. The sky hung low, almost within reach, as if time itself was tired of passing. The streets began to stir with the distant rumble of cars, but there, on that forgotten stretch of sidewalk, silence still held fast. It was a weighty silence, one that occupied space, mixing with the cold wind that cut at the skin and made the girl huddle her shoulders inside her oversized jacket. The man's hands were raw, not raw from cuts or blood, but from that dull ache that comes from rough work, from skin that cracks and won't heal because there's no time for rest. His beard had grown patchy, stained with white in some spots, as if time had forgotten to advance evenly across his face. His eyes, however, remained alive, tired but alive. There was in them that light that only those who still believe in something can keep lit, even when everything else around them has already faded. The broom he pushed wasn't his. It had been found beside a dumpster, leaning against a wall, as if someone had left it there on purpose, as if the world still held small gestures of involuntary generosity. The handle was bent, the bristles uneven and yellowed from use, but it still worked. It could still sweep, and sweeping was what he knew how to do at that moment. Not by choice, not by trade, but because it was the only gesture that still made sense. Sweeping was moving things around. It was creating order, even if temporary. It was doing something when everything seemed immobile. The girl watched. She always watched. She didn't talk much, didn't ask much. She just stayed there, sitting on the edge of the sidewalk, her feet dangling in the cold air, her eyes glued to her father, as if guarding a fragile treasure. She was 7 years old, but seemed to carry a greater age on her shoulders. Her face was small, her cheeks still with that childhood plumpness, but her eyes already knew a gravity that shouldn't have been there. She knew her father was sweeping, not for fun. She knew that every movement of the broom meant something greater. She knew this was about survival. The wet ground reflected everything in a distorted way. The man's reflection appeared stretched, shaky, as if his very image was about to dissolve. The dirty gutter water carried dead leaves, scraps of paper, remnants of lives nobody wanted anymore, and the man pushed everything to the side, creating small piles of debris that would soon be scattered again by the wind. But he kept going, not because he thought it would make a difference, but because to stop was to accept, and to accept at that moment was impossible. People passed by. They passed quickly, eyes fixed forward, steps quickening towards places with names and schedules. No one saw. Or perhaps they saw, but pretended not to, because seeing forces you to feel, and feeling forces you to do something, and doing something is complicated when you're in a hurry, when you have a life already too full of your own problems. So it was easier to look away, to walk straight past, to let the man and the girl become part of the landscape, like lampposts, like signs, like cracks in the asphalt. The man approached a bakery. Its facade was simple, painted white with blue letters faded by the sun. The smell of warm bread escaped through the half-open door, mixing with the cold morning air. It was a smell that made his heart ache, a smell that brought back memories of things that could no longer be touched. The man stopped in front of the entrance, the broom still in his hand, his body hesitant. He took a deep breath, gathered his courage, and pushed the door open. Inside, the heat was stifling after the cold of the street. Fluorescent lights hummed softly, illuminating shelves full of neatly lined breads, plastic-covered cakes, golden pastries that seemed to smile from behind the glass. The clerk was behind the counter, a young man in a white apron stained with flour, his eyes tired from starting work too early. He looked up when the man entered, and there was a second of silence, a second in which everything was said without words. Could I sweep the entrance? Just for a loaf of bread? The man's voice came out low, almost a whisper. It wasn't an arrogant request, it wasn't a demand, it was just an attempt, an offer of exchange, work for food, dignity for survival. The clerk looked at him, and something flickered across his face. Perhaps embarrassment, perhaps pity, perhaps fear that this gesture would become routine, that others would come, that it would turn into something he wouldn't know how to handle. He shook his head. He didn't say no. He just shook his head, his eyes avoiding contact, his hands nervously fiddling with a cloth on the counter. The man didn't insist. He just lowered his face, nodded in understanding, and left. The door closed behind him with the soft chime of the bell hanging on the door frame. Outside, the girl continued waiting. She saw him come out empty-handed and said nothing. She just lowered her gaze to her own feet, as if studying the cracks in the pavement, but the man didn't give up. He started sweeping anyway. He began to clean the bakery entrance, pushing aside the dry leaves, the accumulated trash, the dust the wind incessantly carried. He swept with attention, with care, as if that stretch of sidewalk was the most important in the world. The girl watched him, and in her eyes, something oscillated between admiration and sadness. Admiration because her father hadn't given up. Sadness because she knew that gesture might not mean anything. Time passed slowly, as it always does when you're waiting for something that might never come. The sun tried to pierce through the clouds, creating small patches of light that appeared and disappeared over the asphalt. The sound of brooms, because now there were two, as the girl had picked up a stick and pretended to help, mixed with the distant traffic noise, the muffled bark of a dog, the shout of a news vendor on the corner. No one saw, no one heard. The world moved on, indifferent to those two small figures trying to occupy a space that wasn't theirs. The man swept, the girl waited, and time kept passing. Slow and cruel, marked only by the repetitive motion of the broom on the ground. It was then that the car stopped. It wasn't a sudden stop, not dramatic. It was a calm, deliberate stop, as if the driver had seen something that made them slow down to a complete halt. The car was dark, elegant, with tinted windows that concealed who was inside. It stayed there, parked on the edge of the sidewalk, its engine still running, emitting that deep, steady hum of a good car. Inside, a woman watched. She had seen the man sweeping as she drove past, and something in that image made her step on the brake. She didn't know exactly what. Perhaps it was the man's posture, bent but not broken. Perhaps it was the girl, sitting with that impossible patience for a child. Perhaps it was the act of sweeping without anyone asking, without any promise of reward. There was something in that scene that touched something ancient within her, something she had buried so deep she no longer knew it existed. The woman was about 40, her hair pulled back in a perfect bun, her attire understated but clearly expensive. She wore sunglasses despite the cloudy sky, as if she wanted to create a barrier between herself and the world. Her life was filled with scheduled appointments, important commitments, meetings where decisions affecting numbers and papers were made. She didn't stop, never stopped. Stopping was losing time, and time was what she had least of. But at that moment, she stopped, and she stayed there, watching through the tinted window. As if she was watching a movie, she couldn't pause. The man continued sweeping. He hadn't noticed the car. Or he had noticed, but pretended not to, because he was already accustomed to being invisible. The girl, however, watched. She looked at the car with that cautious curiosity of someone who learned early not to expect anything from anyone. The woman turned off the engine. The silence that followed was heavy. She stayed there for another minute, her hands still on the steering wheel, breathing deeply as one preparing to do something they weren't sure they should do. Then, slowly, she opened the door. The heel of her shoe touched the dirty gutter water. She looked down, saw the expensive sole of her shoe sinking into that dark puddle, and for a second she hesitated. But she didn't turn back. She got out of the car, closed the door carefully, and walked towards the man. Her steps were firm, but there was something uncertain in the way she approached, as if she was crossing an invisible boundary. The man noticed her presence and stopped sweeping. He slowly raised his face, his eyes meeting hers through the dark lenses of her glasses. There was a moment of silence, a moment in which the two sized each other up, trying to understand what this encounter meant. "Why are you sweeping?" she asked. Her voice came out low, almost a whisper, but charged with genuine curiosity. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't pity, it was just a question that asked for an honest answer. The man hesitated. He looked at the broom in his hand, at the half-cleaned ground, at the girl who was now getting up from the sidewalk and walking towards him. Then he looked back at the woman. "Because it's what I can do. For now." The answer came simple, without drama, without self-pity. It was just the truth, the naked truth of someone who had lost much, but hadn't lost the ability to do something. The girl approached and clutched the hem of her father's shirt, her small fingers gripping the worn fabric like a protective amulet. The woman looked at the girl. She really looked, taking off her sunglasses for the first time. Her eyes were clear, tired, but still capable of seeing, and in that instant, seeing the child's small face, something within her stirred. It wasn't pity, it wasn't cheap charity, it was recognition, as if she was seeing something that had once been, something she understood even without ever having lived it. The world around them seemed to have gone silent. Only their 3 breaths could be heard, mixed with the wind that insisted on blowing. The distant traffic noise seemed far away, unreal, as if it belonged to another dimension. There, on that small stretch of sidewalk, time had stopped, and in each of their eyes there was a different question seeking the same answer. Without saying anything more, the woman turned and entered the bakery. The doorbell chimed again, breaking the silence like an alarm clock shattering a dream. The man and the girl stood there, unsure what to do, unsure if they should wait or leave. They chose to wait. Something in that brief encounter had left a promise hanging in the air, even though no words had been spoken. Inside the bakery, the woman approached the counter. The same clerk who had dismissed the man looked up, and this time his face changed. It changed because she was different. It was visible. She was someone who belonged to the world he knew. She asked for things. Loaves of bread, fruit, milk, a few packs of cookies. The clerk collected everything, placing them in bags with the mechanical efficiency of someone who's done this for years. She paid without looking at the price, put her wallet away, and took the heavy bags. When she came out, the man was still there. He seemed to have rooted to the spot, unable to leave without understanding what had happened. The woman walked up to him and held out the bags. The man looked at them, then at her, then at his own hands, as if he didn't know what to do with them. "This is too much," he murmured, his voice choked. "It's not charity," she replied, with a firmness that was more for herself than for him. "It's respect." That word hung in the air. Respect, not help, not pity, not a handout. Respect. The recognition that this man, even in his current state, was still someone, still had worth, still deserved to be seen. The man lowered his head, and for a moment it seemed he was going to say something, but the words didn't come. He simply accepted the bags, his arms trembling slightly under the weight. The girl, not understanding everything but feeling everything, smiled. It was a small, Shy smile, but it lit up her face like a ray of sunshine piercing dark clouds, and that smile broke the weight in the air, broke the tension, gave back to the world a little lightness. The woman remained there, looking at them, looking as one trying to etch an image into memory, like someone who knows a moment means something but doesn't quite know what. Then, without further words, she returned to her car. The engine started, the wheels turned, and the dark car disappeared around the bend, leaving only the sound of the engine fading away, and the smell of exhaust mixed with the cold morning air. The man stood there holding the bags as if they were made of glass. The girl opened one of the bags and saw the bread inside, the milk, the fruit. Her eyes widened. It had been so long since she had seen so much food together. The man knelt beside her, and together they began to share a still warm loaf of bread. They ate slowly, savoring each piece without haste, as if they feared it would disappear if they ate too quickly. And as they ate, the world began to move around them again. People started passing again, cars started honking, the wind started blowing. But something had changed. Something small, imperceptible to those passing by, but enormous to those standing there. For the first time in a long time, that stretch of sidewalk didn't feel so cold. The following days passed with that strange regularity that street life imposes. The man and the girl returned to that same spot, not because they expected the woman to come back, but because it was what they knew, it was where they were. It was where they could be. The man continued sweeping, now with a clearer purpose, as if that gesture had gained a new meaning after that encounter. The girl continued waiting, but now she looked at the passing cars with a different kind of attention, as if each one could be that dark car returning. And she did return. Not the next day, nor the day after, but she returned. It was on a Thursday morning, when the sun had finally managed to pierce the clouds and cast sharp shadows on the asphalt. The car stopped in the same spot, and the woman got out with the same contained elegance as before. But this time there was something different in her face. There was resolve. She walked up to the man, who stopped sweeping as soon as he saw her. The girl got up from the sidewalk, her eyes wide, her heart beating faster. The woman stopped a few feet from them and spoke directly. "I need someone to take care of a garden." The words came out simple, direct, but loaded with meaning. It wasn't a vague offer, it wasn't disguised welfare. It was work, it was a concrete proposal. The man blinked, trying to process what he had heard. "A garden," he repeated, as if the word belonged to another language. "Yes, a house. Large garden. It's been abandoned for years. Needs someone who knows how to work with their hands. Someone with patience." The man looked at his own raw, calloused hands, hands that knew the harshness of concrete more than the softness of soil. But they were hands that knew how to work. That much he knew. I don't know much about plants," he admitted honestly. "You'll learn," she replied with a simplicity that left no room for doubt. It wasn't arrogance, it was confidence. Confidence that this man, with all he had lost, was still capable of learning, still capable of growing. The man looked at the girl looked at him, and in that look there was a silent question. Can we trust this? Can we try? The man took a deep breath and nodded. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow. I'll leave you the address." She pulled a folded paper from her pocket and handed it to him. 8 in the morning. He took the paper carefully, as if it were an official document, something that couldn't be crumpled or lost. He looked at the handwritten numbers, the neat but hasty handwriting of someone unaccustomed to writing addresses on loose papers. The woman turned to leave, but then stopped and looked at the girl. "Is she coming with you?" The man hesitated. The girl squeezed her father's shirt tighter. "She is," he replied, his voice firm. It wasn't negotiable. Wherever he went, she would go. The woman nodded. Then tomorrow, both of you. 8 o'clock. And she left, leaving behind that silence heavy with possibility. The man kept looking at the paper in his hand for a long time, while the girl clung to him, her face lit by a hope she couldn't name. The sun continued to shine, and for the first time in a long time, that brightness didn't sting his eyes. It felt warm. It felt good. That night, under the overpass where they slept among cardboard boxes and old blankets, the man stayed awake. He looked at the girl sleeping beside him, curled up in an oversized coat, her breathing soft and regular. He thought of all they had lost. He thought of the small apartment that was once home, of the wife who left because she couldn't bear to watch everything fall apart, of the job that vanished along with the factory that closed its doors. He thought of how easy it had been to fall, how fast it had been, how one day he was someone and the next he was nothing. But now there was that paper in his hand, that address, that promise of work, of purpose, of something that felt like a new beginning. He didn't know if it would work out. He didn't know if he could do it. But for the first time in a long time, he had somewhere to go when the sun rose, and that was more than he had yesterday. The next morning arrived with that damp chill that clung to the skin. The man woke the girl early, helped her put on her worn-out sneakers, smoothed her hair with his fingers because they didn't have a comb. They gathered the few things they had and walked to the nearest bus stop. They used the coins they'd managed to collect in recent days to pay for their fares and sat at the back of the bus, looking out the window as if they were going to another planet. The address was in a neighborhood they only knew from passing through, a place where houses had tall gates and gardens that couldn't be seen from the street. The bus dropped them a few blocks away, and they walked the rest of the way. The girl held her father's hand, her small steps trying to keep up with his, her curious eyes observing everything around them. When they reached the gate, the man checked the number 3 times to be sure. It was a large, old house, with a facade that must have been imposing once, but now showed signs of neglect. The paint was peeling in some spots, the windows dusty, and through the gate's bars they could see the garden the woman had mentioned. It was a garden that had once been beautiful, that could still be seen in the structure of things, in the layout of the paths, in the arrangement of the trees. But time and carelessness had turned it into a tangle of tall weeds, flowers that had transformed into weeds, trees that had grown crooked because no one had pruned them. It was a garden that had given up on being a garden, that had surrendered to chaos. The man rang the doorbell. The sound echoed inside the house, muffled, as if passing through many empty rooms. After a few seconds, the door opened and the woman appeared. She wore different, simpler clothes, but she still had that posture of someone who doesn't bend easily. She opened the gate and gestured for them to enter. "Punctual," she said, with something that almost seemed like a smile. "That's good." They entered, their feet stepping on the gravel driveway that was covered with fallen leaves and branches. The woman led them to the back, where the garden revealed itself in its full extent. It was larger than it looked from the front, with flower beds that snaked among trees, a small dry pond in the center, and in the back, a glass greenhouse with half its panes broken. "It's been like this for 5 years, the woman explained, her voice neutral, but with a hint of hidden melancholy. "Ever since my mother died. She took care of this. It was her world. When she left, no one touched it again." The man looked around, trying to see beyond the neglect, trying to see what it could become again. The girl had let go of his hand and walked slowly among the flower beds, her fingers brushing against the tall plants that swayed in the wind. "It doesn't have to be perfect," the woman continued. "It just needs to be something again, something that makes sense." The man looked at her and understood that they weren't just talking about a garden. They were talking about rebuilding something that was broken, to create order where there was chaos, to bring life back to something that had been forgotten. And suddenly, it all made perfect sense. "Where do I start?" he asked. The woman pointed to a shed next to the greenhouse. "There are tools inside. If you need anything that's not there, let me know and I'll provide it. Work at your own pace. Just work." She turned and walked back towards the house. Before going in, she stopped and looked back. "There's a small cottage out back. It's empty. You can stay there while you work here. It's small, but it has a bed and a bathroom. It's better than the street." The words came out simply, without fanfare, like someone offering something practical, not a miracle. But for the man and the girl, it was exactly what it seemed: a miracle. A calm, silent miracle that presented itself as logic when in reality it was pure kindness. The man wanted to say thank you, wanted to say something that expressed the magnitude of that gesture, but the words caught in his throat, so he just nodded, his eyes welling up. The woman entered the house and closed the door, leaving them there in the middle of that wild garden, with an opportunity in their hands and the weight of not disappointing. The first days were for familiarization. The man walked through the garden, trying to understand what was what should stay and what should be pulled out. The girl followed him, asking questions about everything, touching the plants with that childlike curiosity that transforms observation into learning. They slept in the small cottage out back, and for the first time in a long time, they had a solid roof over their heads, walls around them, a door that closed. The girl slept through the night without waking, and the man spent hours looking at the ceiling, almost unable to believe it was real. Slowly, the work began. The man pulled up tall weeds, gathered fallen branches, cleared the paths. It wasn't quick or easy work. His body ached, his hands bled, the sun burned. But there was something deeply satisfying in seeing the ground reappear, in seeing the flower beds regain their shapes, in feeling that every gesture he made was creating something. The girl helped in her own way. She carried small branches, gathered leaves, filled the watering can with water and poured it on the plants that seemed thirstiest. She hummed softly as she worked, inventing little melodies that filled the garden with life, and little by little the garden began to respond. The plants that had been freed from the weeds began to stretch, to reach for the sun. The flowers that had survived covered began to show color. It was a slow process, but it was happening. The woman appeared occasionally, not every day, not all the time. She had her life, her commitments, her duties, but sometimes she would step out the back door and stand there, watching the work being done. She didn't say much. She just watched, as if seeing more than just plants being pruned, as if she was seeing memories being recovered. One day, she brought a box of gardening books, old books with yellowed pages and notes in the margins in someone else's handwriting. She handed them to the man without saying whose they were, but he understood. They were her mother's. They were the books that had guided the creation of that garden decades ago, and now they were being passed on, like secret knowledge that couldn't be lost. The man studied the books at night, by the light of the lamp in the little cottage, with the girl already asleep beside him. He learned about soil types, about when to prune, about how to graft. He learned names of plants he had never heard, techniques that seemed simple on paper but required patience in practice. And during the day, he tried to apply it all, making more mistakes than successes at first, but learning with each error. Weeks passed. Autumn gave way to winter, and the garden entered that dormant period where everything seems to stop. But the man didn't stop. He used that time to repair the greenhouse, replacing the broken panes with the help of a glazier the woman called. He cleaned the dry pond, removed the rotted leaves from the bottom, repaired the drainage system. He built new trellises for the climbing plants, painted the rotting wooden benches, leveled the paths. The girl grew. Not physically, not yet, but in another way. She talked more, smiled more, asked more. She started going to school again, enrolled by the woman in a nearby public school. Every morning the man would take her to the gate, straighten the collar of her donated uniform shirt, kiss her forehead, and watch her go in. And every day, when she returned, she would find her father in the garden working and run to him to tell him what she had learned. Gradually, a routine formed, a routine that had form, structure, predictability. The man woke with the sun, prepared a simple coffee, woke the girl, took her to school, and then returned to work in the garden. He'd grab a quick lunch, continued working until the afternoon, picked up the girl. They returned together, and she would do her homework while he finished his workday. At night, they ate something he prepared with the groceries the woman left in a basket by the cottage door every week, and then rested, talking about the day, about the plants, about plans for the next day. And the garden responded. With time, with care, with attention, it began to return to what it had been. The roses began to bloom again, shy at first, but then exuberant. The fruit trees, properly pruned for the first time in years, promised a bountiful harvest. The pond, now clean and with running water again, attracted songbirds that came to drink and bathe. The repaired greenhouse sheltered new seedlings that the man planted with patience, following the instructions in the old books. The woman spent more and more time in the garden. At first it was just a few minutes, but then she began to linger longer. She would bring a book and sit on one of the freshly painted benches, or she would simply walk along the paths, stopping to look at a flower, to touch a leaf. Sometimes she talked to the man about the plants, about what had been done and what still needed to be done. Other times she just stayed there in silence, and the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who understand that not everything needs to be said. One day she brought the girl to the pond. She showed her the small fish that had appeared, no one knew from where. She told her that when she was a child, she used to sit there and invent stories about where the fish went when they dove deep. The girl listened, with her eyes wide with wonder, and then began to invent her own stories, stories about traveling fish that knew secret underwater worlds. The woman laughed. It was a genuine, spontaneous laugh that seemed to surprise her, as if she had forgotten she was capable of laughing that way. The man watched from afar, pruning a rose bush. He saw the two of them there, the woman and the girl, talking about imaginary fish, and felt something strange in his chest. It wasn't pain, it was something warm, something expanding, something that felt like gratitude, but was greater than that. It was the feeling of being part of something larger than himself, of helping to mend, not just a garden, but also two people who had forgotten how to live. The months continued to pass. Winter gave way to spring, and spring exploded in the garden with a force that surprised even the man. Everything he had planted, pruned, cared for, now sprouted and bloomed simultaneously. The garden transformed into a sea of colors and scents, with flowers of all kinds vying for space, birds building nests in the trees, butterflies dancing among the petals. It was impossible not to feel that there was life there, true, pulsating life that refused to give up. The woman began to receive visitors, old friends she had pushed away over the years, distant relatives who hadn't visited in ages. She received them in the garden, served tea in porcelain cups that had belonged to her mother, and proudly showed off the work that was being done. People commented, admiring, on how beautiful it was, on how incredible it was to see that place revive. And the woman always made a point of introducing the man, of saying that none of it would be possible without him, without his work, without his dedication. The man heard that and didn't know what to do with the compliments. He wasn't used to being seen, he wasn't used to being acknowledged. For years he had been invisible, a shadow sweeping sidewalks and not even receiving a glance. And now here he was, being introduced as a gardener, as responsible for all that beauty, being treated with respect and admiration. It was disconcerting, but it was also healing. With each compliment, each sincere thank you, something broken inside him began to mend. The girl also changed. She was taller, stronger, more confident. At school, she had made friends. She brought home drawings she made in art class, drawings of flowers and gardens that she hung on the walls of the little cottage. She talked about what she wanted to be when she grew up, about the places she wanted to see, about the dreams she was starting to have the courage to dream. Her father listened to everything attentively, with that silent love of someone who knows that the greatest gift one can give a child is the possibility to dream. One Saturday afternoon, when the garden was particularly beautiful under the golden light of the late day, the woman called the man and the girl to sit on the bench near the pond. She had something in her hand, a white envelope. She handed it to the man without saying anything at first, just observing his reaction. The man slowly opened the envelope and found a work contract inside. A formal contract with values, rights, duties, signed by her and awaiting his signature. He read the paper several times, making sure he had understood correctly. It was a real job, with a fixed salary, with all the guarantees someone can have. "I don't understand," he said, his voice choked. "Why?" "Because you transformed this place," she replied, making a sweeping gesture that encompassed the entire garden. "Because you brought back something I thought was lost forever. And because you deserve stability. Both of you deserve it." The man looked at the girl looked at him, and without needing to say anything, both understood that this wasn't just about a job. It was about dignity. It was about being seen. It was about having worth. It was about starting over in a way they didn't even know was possible. He signed the contract with a slightly trembling hand. The woman put the paper back in the envelope and smiled, a small but genuine smile. Then she got up and walked back to the house, leaving the two of them there, sitting on the bench, watching the fish swim in the pond as the sun slowly set. That night in the little cottage out back, the man stayed awake for hours. He thought of everything that had happened since that first morning when he had tried to sweep the sidewalk in exchange for a loaf of bread. He thought of how life can completely change with a single gesture of kindness, with a single person who decides to see when everyone else is blind. He thought of how he himself had changed, from someone who merely survived to someone who had purpose, who created things, who made a difference. And he thought of the woman, that woman who stopped her car when no one else would, who offered work when everyone else offered pity, who treated him as a human being when the world treated him as invisible. She had changed too. He could see that. The rigidity in her face had softened. The weight on her shoulders seemed lighter. She smiled more, talked more, seemed more present in her own life. The garden had healed her too, in a way she herself might not yet fully understand. The following years were years of consolidation. The garden remained beautiful, moving through the seasons with that comforting regularity that only nature can offer. The man became not just a gardener, but a guardian of that space, knowing each plant by name, understanding every corner, sensing when something was wrong even before he could see it. The girl grew up there, running among the trees, studying in the shade, bringing friends to see that magical place that was her home. The woman and the man developed a quiet friendship, built on mutual respect and unsaid gratitude. They talked about plants, about life, about memories. She told stories about her mother, about how she cared for the garden with religious devotion, about how that was the place where she felt most herself. He listened and sometimes shared his own bits of the past, the moments before everything fell apart, the memories of when he had a life that made sense. There was no drama, no spectacular twist. The transformation was gentle, constant, made of small moments that accumulated over time, a plant that bloomed, a shared smile, an afternoon of comfortable silence, a whispered thank you, an unexpected hug from the girl to the woman on a day she was sad, a cup of coffee offered by the man on a cold morning. These were small gestures, but it was from them that this new reality was built. One day, 3 years after that first morning on the sidewalk, the woman suggested they make a small memorial for her mother in the garden. Nothing ostentatious, just a simple stone plaque with her name and a phrase she used to say, "A garden grows with love, not with haste." The man agreed, and together they chose the perfect spot, near the rose bush her mother liked best. On the day the plaque was placed, they held a small ceremony. Just the three of them, the woman, the man, and the girl, now 10 years old. The woman spoke about her mother, about what that garden meant to her, about how important it was for that place to remain alive. The girl placed fresh flowers around the plaque, and the man, who had not known the woman's mother, promised in a low voice that he would continue to care for that place as if it were sacred. And it was sacred, in a way. Not in the religious sense, but in the human sense. It was a place where 3 wounded souls had found healing, where loneliness had been replaced by companionship, where despair had given way to hope, where invisibility had been exchanged for recognition. It was a garden, yes, but it was also much more than that. It was physical proof that goodness still exists in the world, that people are still capable of seeing, that redemption is possible, even when all seems lost. The years continued to pass. The girl became a teenager, then a young adult. She studied, graduated, received a scholarship to college. On the day she left to begin this new phase, she hugged her father for a long time, both crying unashamedly. Then she hugged the woman and whispered a thank you that carried years of gratitude. The woman held the girl's face in her hands and said, "You've always been special. Never forget that." And the girl left, carrying with her all the lessons learned in that garden, all the stories heard, all the memories built. But she always came back, always, on holidays, on weekends, whenever she could, because that place was home, not the house where she was born, but the home where she learned to live. The man grew old in the garden. His hands became more calloused, his back more stooped, his hair whiter. But his eyes remained alive, shining with that light of someone who had found purpose. He woke every day and continued doing what he had done for years, caring for the plants, pruning the trees, cleaning the paths. But now he did it not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because that work had become part of him, as essential as breathing. The woman also aged. The wrinkles around her eyes deepened, not from sadness, but from so much smiling. She had learned to live again. She had reconnected with people, had opened her house for gatherings and parties, had transformed that space that was once only hers into a welcoming place. And all because a man had stopped in front of her house years ago, offering to sweep sidewalks in exchange for food, and she had decided to see in him not what he was at that moment, but what he could become with an opportunity. One autumn afternoon, many years after that first encounter, the two were sitting on the bench near the pond. The sun was slowly setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The garden was quiet, only the sound of leaves rustling in the wind and the distant song of a bird. They didn't speak, they just watched. After a long silence, the woman said, "You saved this garden." The man shook his head slowly. "No, I just cared for it. You saved it when you decided not to let it die." "Perhaps we saved it together," she suggested. The man smiled. It was a small, tranquil smile of someone who had made peace with the past and was at peace with the present. "Perhaps," he agreed. They stayed there until the sun had completely set. They didn't need any more words. They had already said everything that needed to be said over the years, not with speeches, but with gestures, with presence, with fidelity to the silent agreement they had made that first day, to care for that space and for each other, expecting nothing more than what life had already given. When darkness completely enveloped the garden, they got up and each went to their own space. The woman to the big house, the man to the small cottage out back. But before going in, he stopped and looked back at the garden that could barely be seen in the darkness. And he thought of how everything could have been different, how he could have given up that first morning, how that woman could have just driven past as everyone else did, how a single moment of kindness had changed not one, but 3 lives completely. The next day, he woke with the sun, as he always did. He made his coffee, put on his work boots, and went out into the garden. The plants greeted him with dew glistening on their leaves. The birds sang their morning melodies. The world kept turning, the seasons kept changing, life kept happening. And he remained there, doing what he did best, caring. Caring for the garden, caring for the memories, caring for the hope that even in the darkest moments there is still light, there is still goodness, there is still the possibility of a new beginning. The story had no epic ending, no moment of absolute glory. It had only the quiet continuity of days well lived, of work well done, of genuine human connections. And perhaps that is precisely what makes this story true, because real life is not made of spectacular moments. It is made of small gestures repeated with love and dedication. It is made of people who choose to see when it would be easier to ignore. It is made of second chances offered without judgment. It is made of gardens that flourish, not because they are perfect, but because someone refuses to let them die. One morning, years later, when the man was quite old, his hands trembling slightly as he held his tools, he stopped in the middle of the garden and looked around. He saw everything that had been built. He saw the rose bushes he had planted that were now thick trunks covering entire trellises. He saw the trees that had been pruned and now gave generous shade. He saw the crystal-clear pond where the fish swam peacefully. He saw the greenhouse full of life. He saw the memorial plaque shining under the morning light, and he remembered that first morning when all he had was a broom found in the trash and the stubborn hope of getting a loaf of bread. He remembered the feeling of invisibility, of not mattering to anyone, of being alone in the world, even surrounded by people. He remembered the constant fear of not being able to feed his daughter, of seeing her go hungry, of not being able to protect her. And then he looked at where he was now, at the garden that was his home, at the work that was his purpose, at the life he had rebuilt brick by brick, petal by petal, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the peace of someone who has everything, but the peace of someone who has enough, the peace of someone who knows they are seen, that they are valued, that they matter. The woman appeared at the back door, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She had a habit of doing this on Saturday mornings, when she had no commitments and could drink coffee peacefully in the garden. She walked up to him and held out one of the cups. He thanked her with a nod and took a sip, feeling the warm liquid go down his throat. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, noticing the distant expression on his face. "How strange it is," he replied. After a moment, how life can completely change because of one moment, a single moment where someone decides to stop and see. She smiled, that smile that had become common over the years, but which at first was so rare. "I think about that sometimes too. How I almost didn't stop, how I was late, had a meeting, had 1,000 things to take care of, but something made me hit the brakes." "Uish, what was it?" he asked, curious. It was a question he had never asked in all those years. She thought for a moment, her eyes fixed on the pond. "I think it was the way you were sweeping," she finally said. There was something in that gesture. It wasn't begging, it wasn't desperate, it was dignified. You were offering work, not asking for charity, and that touched me. It reminded me that dignity has nothing to do with a bank account. The man nodded, understanding. They stayed there in silence for a few more minutes, drinking coffee, watching the garden awaken with the morning. Then the woman said, "Sometimes I wonder who saved whom. You think I saved you, but maybe you saved me too." He looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I was lost," she admitted, her voice low. "After my mother died, I just functioned. I went to work, came home, slept, repeated. I didn't feel anything. I wasn't living, just existing. And then I saw you sweeping that sidewalk with your daughter beside you, and something in me woke up. It reminded me that there are still things that matter, that humanity still exists, that I don't have to live just on autopilot." She paused, looking around the garden. "Rebuilding this place was rebuilding myself, and you gave me the opportunity to do that, so no, you don't need to thank me. We both needed each other." The man felt a lump in his throat. For all those years, he had carried so much gratitude, so much weight of owing thanks, of reciprocating what he had received. And now he discovered it wasn't a one-way street, that this woman, who seemed to have everything, was also broken, also needed healing, also was searching for something that would give meaning to life. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse, "for telling me that." She smiled and lightly touched his shoulder, a quick gesture but loaded with meaning. "You're welcome, and thank you too, for everything." She went back inside the house, and the man stayed there, finishing his coffee alone. But he didn't feel alone. He felt part of something. He felt connected. He felt alive in a way that went beyond just breathing. Days continued to pass with that comforting regularity. The garden went through its seasons, each bringing its own beauty. The man continued caring. The woman continued living there. And the girl, now not so much a girl, kept returning whenever she could, bringing with her the energy of the outside world, but always reconnecting with that place that was her roots. On one visit, already graduated from college and about to start her first real job, she walked through the garden with her father. She was taller than him now, but still held his hand as she did when she was a child. "Dad," she said, stopping near the pond, "do you remember that first morning, when you tried to sweep in exchange for food?" "How could I forget?" he replied, a half smile on his lips. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if she hadn't stopped," the girl continued, her voice serious. "Where would we have gone? What would have become of us?" The man looked at his daughter, saw the strong and confident woman she had become, and felt his chest tighten with pride mixed with a retrospective fear of everything that could have gone wrong. "I don't know," he admitted, "but she stopped, and that changed everything." "Why?" the girl insisted. "Why did she stop when no one else would?" The man thought about the question, about the answer the woman had given years before. "Because she saw," he finally said. "In a world where everyone looks but no one truly sees, she chose to see, to really see, to see the human being behind the situation." The girl was quiet for a moment, processing. "I want to be like that," she said then. "When I have my own life, my own job, my own money, I want to be the kind of person who sees, who stops, who helps not out of pity, but because she recognizes humanity." Her father squeezed his daughter's hand, his eyes moist. "You already are that kind of person," he said. "Growing up here taught you that. It taught you that dignity is never lost, no matter where you are, and that a simple gesture can change an entire life." They stood there, father and daughter, observing the garden that had been the stage for the greatest transformation of their lives. A garden that was much more than plants and flowers. It was a symbol. It was proof. It was a silent testament that the world still has a way, that people can still be good, that hope is still worthwhile. The afternoon was fading when the woman joined them. The three of them sat there on the bench near the pond, watching the sun paint the sky with impossible colors. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Everything had already been said over the years, in 1,000 small gestures, in 1,000 small kindnesses, in 1,000 small moments of genuine connection. The sun set slowly, as it always does, indifferent to human dramas, but a silent witness to everything. Shadows grew, colors disappeared, the garden plunged into twilight. But there was something comforting in that darkness, because they knew the sun would return tomorrow, that the garden would still be there, that life would continue to unfold with its mix of beauty and pain, of gains and losses, of endings and new beginnings. And when night fully took over, they got up. The girl hugged her father and the woman, promising to return soon. The father returned to his small cottage, the woman returned to her house. But before going in, each looked back at the garden invisible in the darkness and smiled, because that place was no longer just a garden. It was a sanctuary, a sacred place where 3 wounded souls had found healing, where kindness had triumphed over indifference, where dignity had been restored, where family had been redefined not by blood ties, but by the bonds of respect, gratitude, and silent love that had built up over the years. And if there were an invisible narrator observing that scene, he might whisper, "Sometimes. True wealth is not in what you have, but in what you give. It's not in accumulating, but in sharing. It's not in walking straight past, but in stopping, in seeing, in recognizing that all of us, at some point, are just trying to sweep the floor in exchange for a little dignity, and that the greatest greatness a human being can achieve is to choose to see that in another, to choose to stop. To choose to help, not because they are obligated, but because they recognize humanity, because they understand that all of us are fragile, all of us need each other, and that a single gesture of kindness may not save the entire world, but it can save someone's world, and sometimes, just sometimes, it can save our own world too. If this story touched your heart, like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.